a regular Bellevue City Council meeting on this beautiful evening of June 7th, 2021. Subbing in for Charmaine tonight, as clerk, we have Karen Roberts. So clerk, could you please call the roll?
Mayor Robinson?
Here.
Deputy Mayor Newmanhouse?
Here.
Councilmember Barksdale?
Here.
Councilmember Lee?
Here.
Councilmember Robertson?
I'm here.
Councilmember Stokes?
Here.
Councilmember Zahn?
I'm here.
Councilmember Zahn, could you please lead us in the flag salute?
Yes, Mayor. I pledge allegiance
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States
of America
and to the
and to the
republic
republic
for which
for
it
which it
stands,
stands,
one nation,
nation,
under God,
God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We have two proclamations tonight. The first one is for LGBTQ and Pride Month, and that's going to be read by Deputy Mayor Newmanhouse.
Thank you, Mayor. My honor to do so. The proclamation reads as follows. Whereas the city of Bellevue is a welcoming community that firmly believes in the city council's vision statement, Bellevue welcomes the world, our diversity is our strength. We embrace the future while respecting our past. And whereas it is recognized that the contributions of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, LGBTQ people both in our community and nationally have been critical to advancing equity. And whereas while it is important to recognize and celebrate the substantial gains made toward greater visibility and acceptance for important topics and LGBTQ community members, the city recognizes that further progress is essential to achieving equity for all. And whereas LGBTQ youth made up 27% of the unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness in King County as measured in the one-night count of 2020. And whereas LGBTQ youth are disproportionately impacted by issues related to homelessness, mental health, and isolation, and these issues have become more pronounced during a time when COVID-19 is present in the community and throughout our nation. And whereas in solidarity with the LGBTQ community, the city of Bellevue will raise and fly pride flags at City Hall and several other city-owned facilities during the month of June and works with community partners to place pride banners in downtown corridors. Now, therefore, I, on behalf of Lynn Robinson, Mayor of the City of Bellevue, Washington, and on behalf of its City Council, do hereby proclaim the month of June 2021 as LGBTQ Pride Month in Bellevue, and the City of Bellevue affirms its support and acceptance of LGBTQ youth, adults, allies within the community. Further, we are proud and supportive of the meaningful, long-lasting impacts the LGBTQ community has made, including community support activities and mechanisms employed during COVID-19 and the many contributions they've made to Bellevue's rich and diverse history and culture.
Thank you. The next one is a Bike Everywhere Month proclamation, which we normally do in June because that's normally when Bike Everywhere Month is, but they tricked us and they did it in May instead. But since you should be biking everywhere every month, we're going to do it now anyway. So Councilmember Barksdale, could you please read that proclamation?
Will do. Thank you, Mayor. Whereas statewide, hundreds of thousands of people travel by bicycle for transportation and recreational purposes, providing health, environmental, and economic benefits. And whereas building bicycle-friendly communities is known to improve people's health, quality of life, and community spirit while improving safety and reducing pollution. And whereas Cascade Bicycle Club, the League of American Bicyclists, the City of Bellevue's Choose Your Way Bellevue program, and other organizations supported bicycling during the month of May 2021. And whereas these groups encourage greater public awareness of bicycle operation and safety education to reduce collisions, injuries, and fatalities. And whereas Bellevue this year has improved its bike system with projects on 108th Avenue Northeast, Northeast Spring Boulevard, Northeast 12th Street, East Trail, and Mountains to Sound Greenway. And whereas the city will implement an East Bellevue demonstration greenway project later this year to make it easier for people to ride around their neighborhood. And whereas the best way to enjoy bicycling is simply by riding to the store, to work, or just for fun. Now, therefore, I, on behalf of Lynn Robinson, Mayor of the City of Bellevue, Washington, and on behalf of its City Council, do hereby proclaim that May 2021 was Bike Everywhere Month in Bellevue and urge all residents to join me in appreciating the unique contributions that bicycling brings throughout the year.
Great, thank you. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? City Clerk, do we have anybody signed up for oral communications tonight?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We had 2 speakers signed up to speak this evening. Our first speaker is Mila Tari. And I don't see her name showing in the attendees. So I'm not sure that she's on the call tonight. Our second speaker that signed up this evening is John Belay. Mr. Belay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead. Your time begins now.
Oh, all right. Fantastic. I definitely won't take the 3 minutes. I live over here in Lake Hills, next to the Temple B'nai Torah. And I just want to give the council a data point, a positive one, by the way. You probably don't hear those too much, but there is a tent city encamped presently, and I believe that they're going to be asking for an extension sometime soon. And I wanted to let you know that there's absolutely nothing going on. There's no trash, there's no shopping carts, nobody wandering around aimlessly. There's no noise, there's no smells. It's just neighbors. So I just wanted to let you know that, and that I support what's going on over there, and their activity. And just before this, the LGBT month proclamation was read, and as I was listening to that, I heard that there's going to be flags raised and that sort of thing, which is great. But action's even better. And, and also I think there was something about having a significant percentage of the LGBTQ youth as homeless. We can support them by continuing to support TBT, their encampment over there, the tent city. So that's all I've got to say. And I thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Thank you.
That is the end of our pre-registered list. Are there any members of the public connected to this meeting that would like to speak and did not pre-register? If so, please use the raise hand function in Zoom if you are connected with a computer, or use *9 to raise your hand if you're connected with a telephone. So we did have one other person raise their hand to speak, and that is Donna Blankenship. Ms. Blankenship, can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay, go ahead. Your time starts now.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to report to the council. I'm a member of Temple B'nai Torah and an officer of the synagogue, and I also live in the neighborhood. And I just wanted to let you know that things are going well with the encampment. We haven't had any security issues or anything too serious happen. We had one resident of the encampment go to the hospital with a health issue, which was, scary, but he seems to be on the mend now. And it wasn't anything related to the encampment. It was just something that went wrong with his body. And I just wanted to say thank you to the council for updating the ordinance that allowed us to bring this group back to Bellevue, and also thank you to our neighbors who have been so welcoming and helpful, bringing over meals and other things, and generally having a really positive experience. And that's about all I had to say.
Thank you so much.
Is there anyone else that would like to speak this evening? Seeing none, that ends oral communications.
Okay, thank you. So next up, we have a report from our city manager, Mr. Miyake.
Good evening, Mayor Robinson and council members. I have one item under the city manager's report to report on this evening. This is a really good news story that highlights multiple awards we have received on our Spring Boulevard transportation projects. With that, I am going to turn it over to Andrew Singalakis, our transportation director, to provide you more details about these awards. Andrew?
Thank you, City Manager Miyake, Mayor Robinson, and Deputy Mayor Neuenhuis and the City Council. Is my screen being shared?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is a rare event when one capital project from the city wins 3 state and regional level awards. And that is what has happened with our Spring Boulevard project, specifically the part between Northeast 12th and 124th Avenue Northeast. This is just for information only, no direction is needed. I'll give you a really brief construction history, project features, project awards, and then thank yous to staff and others who made the project possible. And as you can see, this is just one segment of a larger project, but for this particular segment, it was a lot in the works. So it started out in 2016 and it went until the ribbon cutting last October. And some of the features of the project, it created a new half-mile multimodal road with sidewalks and bike lanes and everything attached to it. 2 bridges, one over East Link and the other one over East Rail. 4 lanes with turn pockets, 5 new traffic signals, and an upgrade to water infrastructure in the area. And again, we did really a state-of-the-art project with everything separated bike and ped facilities, a multi-use path, and a pedestrian scramble near the East Link station. That's where when the traffic, the light signal turns to walk, you can go in any different direction, which is something that's needed for high pedestrian environments. And also we looked at the Bellevue vision for ideas on urban design for the design of the project, low impact development, bioretention swales, and also advanced landscaping to complement future transit-oriented development. And the project is completed. There are other phases of the project that are still ongoing. And we did have our in-person event to ribbon cutting last year. And here are the awards that we received from the Washington chapter of the American Public Works Association, 2021 Project of the Year for $25 to $75 million category, Seattle chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the Washington chapter of the American Council of Engineering Companies. And with that, I want to send out a big thank you for staff. He's not listed here, but Ron Kessick is the Assistant Director of a Capital Project. Steve Costa is the Project Manager, along with Ting Ting Ma, Brad Wheeler, and Todd Hopkins. Your work is very much appreciated. And then also to HDR Engineering, Johansson Excavating, KLB Construction, Interwest Construction, and also some of our stakeholders, Sound Transit and Wright Runstad. And with that, that concludes my presentation.
That's incredible. Congratulations. And thank you. Thank you for such good work, award-winning work. Is there anything else, Mr. Miyake?
Not at this time, Mayor.
Okay.
End of the report.
All right, thank you. We are on to consent calendar. Do I have a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I move to approve the consent calendar.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. So we have 3 study session items. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce the first one?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Robinson and council members. The first item on the agenda is the state law required open government training for the council. With that, I am going to turn this over to Kathy Gerla, our city attorney, for more details about this training, as well as to introduce our guests this evening. So Kathy?
Thank you, Mr. Miyake. Good evening, council. As Mr. Miyake mentioned, the training tonight is mandated by the state. The state legislature has required that all elected officials receive refresher training at least every 4 years on the Open Public Meetings Act, the Public Records Act, and state record retention requirements. Joining us tonight to provide that training are Jessica Skelton and Matt Siegel. Ms. Skelton and Mr. Siegel are attorneys with the Pacifica Law Group. They each have extensive experience helping municipalities understand these sometimes complex, not always intuitive, but very important laws. And some of you may remember them from a few years ago because Jessica and Matt gave the last set of refresher training to this council a few years ago. So tonight they will cover the basics of some of these laws as a refresher, as well as hot topics and new developments that may have happened in the last couple of years. There is no action being asked of the council tonight. This is to meet the mandatory training requirements. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica and Matt to give their presentation. And they, of course, are also here tonight to answer any questions that any council members may have as part of the training. So Jessica.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for that introduction. And it's nice to be here tonight, at least virtually, and see your faces again, and some of you for the first time. I've worked with the city of Bellevue for almost 15 years now in a variety of capacities. And as Kathy mentioned, Matt and I have provided this training a few times in the past. So we'll do our best to update you on recent developments and provide a good overview of both the Open Public Meetings Act and the Public Records Act. And I think Matt is going to say just a brief hello while I get the presentation ready.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Kathy, Mayor Robinson, and council members. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I've actually worked with the city as outside counsel for over 20 years now, and I do know many of you. And many of you have also seen a version of this presentation before. And those of you who have, you'll be happy to know we do have some new material for you tonight. So stay tuned. Jessica is going to start out talking about open meetings and executive sessions. And then I will come back to cover everybody's favorite topic, and that is the Public Records Act. So with that, Jessica, take it away.
Great. And can everyone see the share?
Yes.
And it sometimes takes just a minute to advance. So as Matt mentioned, I'm going to start by talking about the Open Public Meetings Act, which is an act that applies to all public agency boards and commissions in Washington state. And it is codified at Chapter 4230 RCW in the Washington statutes. I want to mention as I get started here, it's a little more challenging to take questions in the Zoom environment. So I'll make sure to pause at the end of the Open Public Meetings Act portion and answer any questions. And then Matt will do the same at the end of the Public Records Act section. And we're happy to field any additional questions you have at the end. So as Kathy mentioned, a few years ago, the Washington legislature adopted a requirement that all members of public bodies in Washington receive Open Public Meetings Act training on a regular basis. And so you're required to receive that training either after you take the oath of office or assume your duties, and then again at intervals of no more than 4 years. And so here we are providing that training consistent with that 4-year schedule. As I mentioned, the Open Public Meeting Act applies to governing bodies, but it's not just limited to bodies like the City Council. It actually applies to all the boards and commissions, committees of the council or other policy or rulemaking bodies of a public agency or any committee thereof when the committee takes action on behalf of the governing body. And there's actually been a fair bit of litigation around what is a committee thereof. I know that Bellevue doesn't tend to use a lot of committees, but if you ever find yourself joining one and you have questions about whether your committee is subject to the Open Public Meetings Act, that's a very good question to raise with city staff. So the OPMA Basics, which you all should be familiar with at this point, are first that all meetings must be open to the public except for authorized executive sessions. And there are some additional requirements, which is that there must be a notice of the meeting, there must be a published agenda and published meeting minutes. And the critical requirement is that when city business is received, discussed, or acted upon, a quorum of members of the governing body must be present. And quorum means a majority of the members. So as I mentioned, agendas are required to comply with the OPMA, and they must be posted 24 hours before the meeting. That's something that city staff takes care of for you. But the two pieces that you may be interested in are that first, at a regular meeting, any member of a governing body can move to amend the proposed agenda by adding an item or proposing another change. And that's for regularly scheduled meetings according to your published meeting schedule. You can also convene a special meeting for a special purpose, and you have to give special notice for those types of meetings. And when you do that, only an action that appears on the agenda for the special meeting can be taken at that meeting. You cannot add items to an agenda for a special meeting. Now, I mentioned that action is one of the defining features of what the OPMA talks about. And so there's actually a definition of action under the OPMA, and it's very broad. So it includes things like the receipt of public testimony, deliberations, discussions, considerations, reviews, evaluations, and final actions. So contrary to the term action, it's not just the vote, it's everything that's leading up to that when you're discussing and deliberating and considering action items that will come before the city council. And as I mentioned, the quorum requirement is that no action can be taken by a governing body except when you're in a public meeting. Now, the flip side of that is that a meeting actually doesn't take place if a quorum is not present. So if you don't have a majority of members of a governing body present, then the OPMA does not apply to those discussions or deliberations. You have to have a quorum present for that. But if you take action by a quorum of members outside of a public meeting, that is a violation of the OPMA. And that is where most of the litigation and claims that arise from the OPMA occurs. So as a member of a governing body, you should be very careful not to take action, whether intentionally or unintentionally, outside of a regularly scheduled public meeting or a properly constituted special meeting. And again, remember the broad definition of action. It's not just voting, it's discussions and deliberations and everything leading up to that final action. So as I mentioned, the action outside of a public meeting is one of the areas where there's been the most litigation under the Open Public Meetings Act. And one of those contexts is in the context of serial meetings. And that is when you have a series of conversations between smaller groups that when you add them together could constitute a quorum and would make what occurred a meeting within the meaning of the Open Public Meetings Act. And so the first time a court really considered an issue like that was in 2001 in this Wood versus Battleground School District case, where the court held that an exchange of emails among the school board members was a meeting under the OPMA. And so that was a situation where a couple of members emailed each other, and then those emails were forwarded to other members and the discussion continued. And at some point, a quorum was reached. And so they were discussing an issue related to the employment of someone by the school district. That was an issue that could come before them, and that constituted action by a quorum of members outside of a regularly scheduled meeting and was an OPMA violation. And so the important thing to remember out of this is that OPMA restrictions apply regardless of the form of communication that you're engaging in, whether you're texting, making online comments, sending emails, phone calls, or in-person conversations. They can all count towards constituting a serial meeting that could potentially violate the OPMA. Now, one helpful piece of clarification that we've received since then, however, is that when you passively receive information, that does not constitute action under the OPMA. And so that was the Citizens Alliance case. Rather, you have to intend to collectively transact official business and communicate about issues that may or will come before the council for a vote in order for it to constitute action that could potentially violate the OPMA. So, for example, I know it's a common practice where city staff members might email all the members of the council, and you're all receiving information about things that could come before you as a governing body. That is not an OPMA violation because you are passively receiving that information. However, if you were to send a response to the entire council and then engage in discussions about those items via email, that is where you would potentially risk having an OPMA violation. One recent case that has occurred since the last time we provided this training, you may have heard about in the news, was a situation that occurred at the Seattle City Council relating to discussions about the head tax that Seattle had adopted. And so in that situation, it arose where after the city had adopted the head tax, 4 council members then participated in a call with a polling consultant about the way that the head tax was polling and the fact that it wasn't very popular with the citizens of Seattle. And so those council members discussed the fate of the tax with that consultant. Wasn't a quorum because it was only 4 members of a 9-member council. But then that discussion led to another series of small group discussions among the council in meetings, phone calls, and electronic communications regarding the potential repeal of the tax. And the one thing that occurred that really became problematic is that some of the city staff members were starting to take a poll of where the council members potentially were on the head tax. And in the meantime, we're preparing a press release about the fact that the city was likely going to adopt a repeal of the tax. And the language in the press release said something to the effect of a majority of the council members were going to support the repeal before the council members had even met on the issue. And so the city was sued. And although the OPMA claim was initially dismissed at the lower court, the Court of Appeals actually reversed that decision on the basis that there's potentially sufficient evidence to constitute an OPMA violation there. And so, something like wanting to know about where various council members are on an issue is a particularly risky thing to engage in. Taking a poll and determining whether there's a majority of council support for a particular issue, that's the kind of thing that really risks an OPMA violation. So the advice there is to avoid any scenario where you would take action in groups such that a quorum would be present in violation of the OPMA. Now, another situation that you may have heard about also in the news, but a few years ago, was when the University of Washington Board of Regents were conducting pre-meeting dinners at a private location. And that also risked an OPMA violation. And so this is the kind of situation that comes up with some frequency, where as council members, you also have lives, you have social gatherings, you're invited to community events, and there's always a risk that other council members could be there or that issues that might come before the council could occur in those situations. And so the advice here is that whenever possible, avoid attending outside events in groups of more than 3 members so that you can seek to avoid constituting a quorum that would violate the OPMA. If you think that there could be more than 3 members present or there are more than 3 members present, be very careful not to take action. And remember the very broad definition of action, which includes discussing any issue that could come before the city. And if you have concerns, if you want to attend an event and you don't know if a quorum might be there, or if there might be issues that would come before the council that may come up, it's always a good time to check with city staff about whether there's anything that you can do to reduce the risk of an OPM violation in that context. Now, you understand, as you've gone through this training several times, that most issues have to come before you in an open public session, but there is a set of exceptions to that. And those are executive sessions, which I'm sure you all have participated in by this point. But the key thing to appreciate here is that these executive session purposes are very limited. They are specified by statute. And I've included some of the most commonly used executive session purposes here. So they include things like selecting or considering the acquisition of real estate and considering the minimum price at which real estate will be offered for sale, reviewing negotiations on the performance of publicly bid contracts, receiving and evaluating complaints or charges brought against a public officer or employee, although the officer or employee can request that that hearing be in public and then it needs to be held publicly, evaluating the qualifications of an applicant for public employment or reviewing the performance of a public employee, but then discussions like salary, conditions of employment, and the final hiring decision all needs to happen in a public meeting. Some additional executive session purposes are to evaluate the qualifications of a candidate for appointment to elective office, but again, the final decision needs to be made in public. And to discuss with legal counsel representing the city matters related to enforcement actions, pending litigation, and potential litigation. But even the statute is very clear that you can't have an executive session just because a lawyer is present. It has to be for enforcing actions, pending litigation, or potential litigation. And there are some other statutory purposes for executive sessions that are less likely to come before the city, but they are all set out by statute. And I'm sure you've experienced the procedure, but before convening an executive session, the presiding officer has to publicly announce the purpose for the executive session and the time that the session will conclude. And you can extend that time by coming back into the public session and announcing that the executive session will be extended. Now, a few years ago in 2017, we did get a helpful Washington Supreme Court decision that signaled that courts are going to interpret these executive session provisions extremely narrowly. So in this particular case, the Port of Vancouver was looking to purchase some property. And so the purpose of the executive session was the minimum price at which real estate will be offered for sale or lease. That was one of the purposes we just looked at a minute ago. And the court held that the plain language of that limitation limits discussion in an executive session to consideration of the lowest acceptable value to sell or lease property. And the court unanimously held that executive sessions could not be used to discuss contextual factors like the impacts on jobs, the environment, the quantity of the land, and property improvements. So in this particular instance, the court had had long, lengthy executive sessions that really went outside of the limited purpose for that executive session. And so it's important to remember that when you're in executive session, you have to keep the discussions and deliberations specific to the limited purpose for the executive session. I also wanted to just briefly touch on the concept of closed sessions, because I know that is an issue that has come up for the city recently related to the Tadeucci lawsuit. And so in that case, the Court of Appeals confirmed some language in the OPMA holding that certain closed sessions are actually exempt from the OPMA. And so that occurs when there's a meeting of a quasi-judicial body that relates to a quasi-judicial matter between named parties as distinguished from a matter having general effect. And when you have that, it's exempt from the OPMA. So this specific takeaways here are it has to be a quasi-judicial session. That's a session where you're engaging in decision-making akin to what a court would do, and it has to be adjudicating a dispute between specific parties. A session cannot be closed if you're acting in a legislative capacity with a quorum. In that instance, the only exceptions are those limited exceptions that we just went over for executive sessions. So that's the distinction between executive sessions. They're the sessions that you can convene in your legislative capacity, whereas a closed session can only occur when you're acting like a court does in a quasi-judicial capacity. Finally, I just want to touch briefly on the question of what the risk is of an OPMA violation. And so we did actually also just receive a recent decision just June 1st on this about the fees and costs that can be imposed against the city. And so in that case, Zink versus the City of Mesa, the Court of Appeals clarified that fees and costs are actually mandatory, and that those fees and costs can significantly exceed the relatively limited penalties that can be imposed under the Act. So this case arose under an older version of the OPMA at a time when the fees and penalties were $100, but the plaintiffs had incurred $20,000 in attorney fees. The court said they were entitled to all of those fees because fees and costs are mandatory. So as I mentioned, the civil penalties are relatively limited, but one thing to note is that they're imposed against you in your personal capacity. And so they are currently $500 for the first violation and $1,000 for subsequent violations. But perhaps more importantly are these last couple of things on the list here, because those fees are relatively limited. But a violation of the Open Public Meetings Act can actually also constitute a basis for a recall action. And that was recognized by the Washington Supreme Court in 2017. And an OPM violation can lead to invalidation of the city's actions and decisions. And perhaps most importantly, it can lead to a loss of public trust and confidence. Obviously, you all are here serving the public and want to ensure that they maintain their confidence in you. And so understanding the requirements of the OPMA is a part of making sure that you can do that. So I will pause here briefly and just see if there are any questions that I can answer before Matt discusses the Public Records Act.
Are there any questions? Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the gallery here. There we go. You can raise your hand if you have any questions. I see Councilmember Stokes with his hand up. Go ahead.
Well, the only question I had is because during a normal year when people go to meetings, and events, there are a lot of events where more than 3 of us are there, usually in a very big room. I don't think it's so strict that you absolutely must only have 3 there, but I guess the suggestion is that if there are 4 or more, we don't talk to each other and we make it clear that we're spread around and not getting together.
Yeah, I think it's fine to talk about the weather, how's your daughter? Those kinds of things are of course okay. I think it's just important as you are to be aware of how many of you are present at an event. And if you are, then you have to avoid taking any action within that very broad definition.
And don't hang around after the meeting.
You don't want to be trapped in a situation where there are 4 of you who are, discussing with, even a citizen, an issue that can come before the council, that would be a violation.
Right. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, not seeing any.
So with that, I will turn it over to Matt to discuss the Public Records Act.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. And the Public Records Act, a lot of cases about the Public Records Act over the years. Hard to believe that it started out as a citizens initiative back in the early 1970s, part of a string of those types of initiatives that were passed around the country after Watergate, mirroring the Federal Freedom of Information Act to some degree, but in particular, as it's developed through the courts in Washington, much broader and stronger in force than the federal law. And you'll probably hear or have heard this phrase that's listed in the second bullet point here, that it's a strongly worded mandate for broad disclosure of public records. That appears in virtually every case the courts have considered under the Public Records Act. And it does emphasize the backdrop at which the courts look at this law. And also the important thing to remember is the default position here, which is essentially that anything that constitutes a public record, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, is subject to disclosure upon request unless there is a specific legislatively created exemption. And there are a number of those, but as a general rule, this is the default. So if you've got a public record and there's no legislative exemption, then the courts don't have the authority to say, don't turn it over because of privacy considerations or something along those lines. They're going to liberally construe that determination to address the question of whether or not, if it's a close call, the record should be disclosed. And even here in our own Public Records Act rules that the city has adopted, we reiterate this premise that the act and the rules will be interpreted in favor of disclosure. So that's the backdrop in which we're operating. In the next slide, you'll see that like the Open Public Meetings Act, we also have mandatory Public Records Act training. And so you're checking the box on that tonight too. But training is something that comes up quite frequently actually in public records cases when they go to court. And the fact that you've been trained and advised on some of the key issues is important in demonstrating that the city is making its best efforts to comply with the statute, and that you are too as officials of the city. So what is a public record? What is the scope of the PRA? Again, when this statute was adopted back in the early 1970s, this was a really easy question. You had written files and, they were on paper. And if somebody wanted to get a copy of them, they'd get a copy of them. If they wanted to come in and inspect those files and read them on site, they could do that. We didn't have a lot of questions about what a record was in 1974. But today, that's become one of the biggest questions as the category of records and writings has become more and more expansive over time. And that's because of the way that we manage information, the way that we communicate, the way that we store data. All of these things have dramatically expanded the concept of what a record or a writing is, well beyond any concept we could have had when this law was adopted. But the bottom line here is this language that says a record is any writing containing information relating to the conduct of government or the performance of a government or proprietary function. And then these four words: prepared, owned, used, or retained by the city in this case. And those words are really broad. When you look at those, and again, they're in the disjunctive. So any of those four things, and it relates to the conduct of government, you've got a public record. And so that is going to be very, very broad. And if you look on the next slide, what you'll see is that we have all sorts of questions that have come up over the course of the years about, whether different types of stored data or information are public record in Washington. And almost every time the answer is yes. The Fisher Broadcasting case is a good example here. And that said that even if you didn't have what you consider to be a traditional file, much less a writing, if you have data that's stored in a database, so that in order to respond to a records request, you could compile information essentially into a file and present it, that is a public record. And you actually have to do that. because you're not required to create a record from scratch. If somebody says, give me a list of these 10 things and you don't have a list, you're not required to create it. But if that data is in a database and someone can, with a couple of keystrokes, create something that would then be responsive, this case said you would have to do that. You're also not required as a requester to specifically identify what that list or what the record might be called. But you do have to identify, at least in a general sense, what you're looking for. And most people do that by asking for a class or category of records or multiple categories of records. Give me every communication about the particular land use proceeding I'm interested in. So you're not saying exactly what those communications might be, what form they might be in, who may have communicated, but you've identified enough information that the request is able to be filled and would be considered, a sufficiently precise request under the statute. So when you look at the history of how we have addressed various forms of public records over time, we can go back a little over 20 years ago now to a time when most people's emails were on AOL or CompuServe. I'm dating myself, but and it's kind of quaint to think that the Court of Appeals had to address this question back in the year 2000 as to whether or not emails were a public record. That was the first question that the case decided, and the answer was yes. At that time, that was a legitimate question. We didn't have an answer. Now, emails are probably one of the most prominent forms of public records that we have. Certainly, they probably top the volume list in terms of records that get searched and produced over the course of the requests that are made throughout the state. And the Tiberino case, which decided that emails were a public record, also talked about this question of whether personal emails were public records. And they said, well, personal emails in this particular case that were on a city email server, those were public records, particularly when the employee was terminated for excessive use of personal email. You contrast that to one of the gold bar cases. There were a lot of gold bar cases on public records over the last few years. But that one of those cases confirming that purely personal emails on your private device, in other words, emails that don't relate to the conduct of government, those are not public records. There was a more recent decision that said, again, reaffirming though, that rule doesn't necessarily apply when you're talking about your city email server. So for example, if you're using a city email address, even if you might have personal content in those emails, they are probably a public record, given the fact that they are located on that city server and retained by the city. And so the real lesson from dating back to that Tiberino case in the year 2000 and other cases we're going to look at in a moment, talking about different types of electronic records, is that it's the content and not the form of the record that really matters. So if the content of the record meets that definition, right, it relates to the conduct of government, and one of those 4 steps applies, it's retained by the city, it's used by the city, those types of things, then it is going to be a public record, no matter what form it's in. And so now we've gone way beyond emails, obviously. We've got text messages, lots of news stories this year about text messages and whether they were properly retained and whether they were lost when public records requests were pending. Other forms of online communications would be similar in nature to that. Certainly Facebook and Instagram posts, tweets, any app you can download and think about that has a communication function is going to potentially implicate the Public Records Act today, because if you're doing something that implicates the conduct of government, you may be creating a public record. And we'll show kind of where that line is drawn here in a moment. But the other thing that's important to know about those types of electronic records, whatever they may be, is that if they do meet that requirement, if they do meet that definition, then you not only have to produce them if they're requested, but they have to be retained under the applicable retention schedules. Now, a lot of these types of online or electronic communications may have no retention value at all. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And that may mean that they're transitory records. They can be deleted, but there are some that may have retention value. And if you are creating those records, you have an obligation to hang on to them. And most importantly, if there is a request pending that would encompass those records, they cannot be deleted while that request is pending. That is the issue that's going on right now with text messages, for example, and the city of Seattle. All right, so let's move on. So in terms of public records and service as a council member, this is probably the most important case to be familiar with in Washington. And it's spawned several other cases since 2015, but it's good to just go back and start with this line of cases because the Nissen decision, which involved the prosecuting attorney for Pierce County, and particularly involved the question of whether records that were located on the personal device, in this case, a cell phone of the prosecutor, whether those were public records that had to be turned over. And the prosecutor in this instance had two cell phones, at least, one that was a county issued cell phone and one that was a personal cell phone. For whatever reason, the personal cell phone had indisputably a bunch of material on it that related to the conduct of government. These were official communications that were going on, whether they were phone calls or text messages. And there were two categories of records that the requesters were interested in this case. They wanted text messages that related to the conduct of government that were on the personal phone, and they wanted the call logs from the personal phone for any calls that related to the conduct of government. And the Supreme Court of Washington said, well, in this case, these are both public records if they meet that definition. If they don't meet that definition, if they're purely personal, for example, that wouldn't apply. They would not be public records. But if they did relate to the conduct of government, the fact that they were on a personal phone as opposed to a city or county phone, that did not matter. And so what does that mean from a practical perspective when you get, or the city gets, public records requests that encompass those types of records? And what I'll say by way of background on this is about 15 years ago, I worked on a case that eventually became Hangardner versus City of Seattle at the state Supreme Court. In this case, I was representing the Seattle monorail project. And this was the first time that I could remember in which there'd been a request for electronic records located on home devices. In this case, it was home computers. We're talking really 2004, 2005. So before the proliferation of records on personal phones. And in that case, the Superior Court in King County ordered that every board member of the Seattle Monorail Project turn over their home computer to be searched and imaged by an expert retained by the requesters. Now, fortunately, the Supreme Court did not allow that order to stand. And it was an extraordinary invasion of privacy because of the fact that these personal computers had everybody's personal records on them, as well as whatever records, if any, may have been responsive to a request about the conduct of the monorail project itself. And these were all volunteer board members, by the way. And so in Nissen, 15 years now later after the Hangardner decision, the court set out a test, which is still being applied, to how to balance avoiding that invasion of privacy for individual council members and other agency employees with the need to identify actual records that might be responsive on those devices. And the test is, first of all, you can self-search your personal computer, your devices, your accounts, wherever it is that these records may exist. And keep in mind, by the way, that you obviously have control over that. So the less of these records might be in these locations, the less searching you have to do, the less retaining you have to do. And then what you have to do after that, in order to avoid for example, the possibility of a third-party search like what was ordered in the Hengardner case, you do an affidavit saying, in good faith, I've done this search and I've either turned over whatever is responsive or nothing is responsive. Or even better, you say in the affidavit, I never use my personal phone or my personal computer to conduct city business. So I know that there's nothing there and I've searched and confirmed that. Now I understand that that is perhaps an aspiration that we can't meet to some degree. And I also noted in a couple of recent presentations talking about the pandemic that the reality is with people working remotely so much over the last year and a half, we do have more records by nature on external devices and hard drives than we've probably ever had. So it may be unrealistic to be able to say, I have never sent a text to my personal phone relating to my city business. But the less you've got to go through, the easier this procedure is. And you want to follow this procedure because this procedure is the most efficient way to work with staff and for you to evaluate on your own whether you have any responsive records. Now, since the Nissen decision, as I said, there's been a number of subsequent cases that have addressed the same test. One of those is this case involving Arthur West and a council member for the city of Puyallup. And the issue here was Facebook posts. And the argument was that there was a closed Facebook account that was run by one of the council members. And the requester argued that those were public records on that closed Facebook account. They needed to be retained and they needed to be turned over. But the Court of Appeals disagreed. Court of Appeals said those particular Facebook posts at issue were not public records. And I'll explain why in a moment. But importantly, the Court of Appeals also said it could be that Facebook posts that are made by a council member on an individual account would be public records under certain circumstances. Let's look at what those circumstances are. So the question is, when you were posting on Facebook, were you acting in the scope of your employment or in an official capacity? And were you posting about the conduct of city government? Again, that phrase. And this is the test. Did your position require that you make those posts? Probably not under the circumstances here. In this case, it certainly didn't, and it probably would not for you. Did the city direct you to make those posts? Did someone say, council member, please post this on your individual site? Or, and this is the one that's a little bit more nebulous, were you somehow furthering the city's interests by posting these in the way that you did? That's the test that will determine whether something like Facebook posts, and again, this test could also apply to other apps or means of electronic or online communication. That's how you're going to tell whether you have an obligation to retain or produce these posts if they're requested of the city in a proper public records request. So if you look at the next slide, you'll see why the Court of Appeals decided that they did not rise to the level of public records in this particular case. First of all, the council member's position did not require that she post on Facebook. She was doing that to talk about the issues, communicate with her constituents, wasn't required. So that part of the test was not met. Also, the Facebook page, again, was not associated with the city. This was the council member door Facebook page. It was not characterized as an official city council page. It was Friends of Julie Dorr. So that was important to the court also. And she was not conducting public business on the Facebook page. Again, she may have been speaking to her constituents about issues of importance, but as the court described it, any tangential benefit to the city was not enough to show that she was acting in the scope of her employment or official capacity. And we had another case that just came out a couple of months ago, very similar case, also brought by Arthur West, a frequent requester, trying to get Facebook posts from council member David Medore of the Clark County Council. And again, the Court of Appeals applied the same test and said these posts did not contain specific details regarding Clark County Council discussions, decisions, or other actions. If anything, as the county argued, because the county was defending this case, the post furthered the council member's own interests by establishing his views on particular policies and inviting discussion among his constituents. So this is really the crux of it here. You've got, and in these materials, you've got a listing of the way that courts are going to look at online postings and decide whether they are personal, campaign, for example, or whether they are public records, and whether you are effectively acting on behalf of the city when you post them. And you want to keep those types of criteria in mind if you're going to be operating on social media. And obviously, in the era in which we live, everybody is pretty much operating on social media. Running a campaign, you almost have to be on social media. Communicating with your constituents, it's nearly expected. And so this, when I say, is the reach of the Nissen decision dating back to 2015. We started with emails and we keep progressing. And it's the same mantra that I said before. It's the substance of what you're doing rather than the form. And so we don't have a case yet with these last two apps listed here, Instagram or Nextdoor. But I use those as examples where there is copious amounts of posting and communication activity. There's already been trial court litigation, I know, about Nextdoor. And so I'm sure that we will see similar cases applying a similar test to different forms of social media. So if you're posting, if you're communicating in that way, those are the things you want to be keeping in mind as you manage your account. And as you work with staff, if you have a question, check with the city attorney's office or check with staff. Always better to ask in advance than find out later that you should have been retaining messages or you should have made some changes to the way you were operating your account. And this leads to another critical question, something that will oftentimes be addressed by staff, at least in the first instance, but important to understand nonetheless. And that is conducting an adequate search. This is a key requirement under the Public Records Act. Somebody makes a request to the city has an obligation to conduct an adequate search. And that's not determined by what happens at the end of the game. So, for example, if you look everywhere you could have reasonably expected to find responsive documents and records, and you end up missing a few, that in and of itself is not necessarily a violation of the Records Act. What is a violation is if you don't look in places where you should have known there were going to be records. And so where this adequate search requirement really comes in for you as council members is when you're working with staff. Staff come to you and say, okay, here's what the request is about. It's about this lawsuit. It's about this condemnation. It's about this land use proceeding. You need to think about, okay, where might I have responsive records? And if you're not sure whether one of those places is someplace you should be looking, ask. But if you don't look in places that should be obvious, and that includes personal devices, if those might include public records under the terms we just talked about, if it includes text messages, if it includes a personal email account, those are things that you need to be thinking about when you're doing a search. And again, staff will help guide that, and staff is usually going to be primarily responsible for conducting a search. But in order to make sure the city searches adequately, you've got to help figure out where might these things be located. And again, that's been a little bit more difficult in the last year and a half, as we've all been scattered in different locations and using different devices, trying to keep up with our obligations. But I am sure, I have said to several people that there will be cases coming out over the next year or two about, did people look adequately where they needed to from the period that they were engaged primarily in remote work? We know those questions are going to come up. So in terms of best practices, I've updated these a little bit over the last 10 years, but remarkably, they stay the same in key respects. And you've got this list in your materials. It's a good thing to revisit, but segregating is really an important thing. It makes your life so much easier if you have to respond to a records request. The more you can keep things separate by device, ideally, if not by device, then by folders or a filing system, so that you're not having in the first instance to try to segregate when a request comes in, the better off you're going to be. And if you do have documents that you are creating on some of these other locations, work with staff to make sure that they're being retained. Staff has ways to help retain those records. You want to make sure that if you have public records, that they are being kept for the necessary amount of time and that you're prepared to produce them efficiently if a request comes in. When it comes to retention, these are first governed by state statutes. And, you know, for some of these, you're going to have things that like official records of proceedings that you're not going to have to worry about retaining. That's something that staff governs. But when we get down to some more specific city related documents and things like communications and trying to figure out when do I have to retain emails, when do I have to retain other forms of electronic communications, that's something that you want to be working with staff on so you understand what your obligations are and you're getting the maximum amount of help you can in that process. If you're getting that help, situations where, you know, messages or documents are lost can really be avoided. And those are the most challenging situations to deal with if a request comes in or if a request is pending and it can't be filled in whole or in part. On that front, I also want to mention the concept of metadata. Metadata, colloquially, we say it's data about data. It's unseen information in electronic files that tells you things about the files, like when they were created, who created them, and a bunch of other information that probably nobody would ever want to know, like, you know, what part of the internet the file came through when it was communicated to you. But a couple of things that are really important to know about metadata. First of all, metadata for each electronic file is going to be unique. So, for example, if an email gets sent to the entire city council, the version that Councilmember Stokes received has different metadata than the version that Councilmember Robertson receives. Even though the email itself, the text, the header, everything else might be exactly the same. And so that creates potentially unique, independent public records. And the other thing that's really important to remember is that unless a requester specifically says that they want metadata, in other words, that they want a copy of whatever that hidden information is, the city doesn't have to provide it. You have to ask for it. But if a requester does ask for it, they're entitled to it. And that's really important because if you don't save records in the appropriate format, metadata for those records can be lost. So that's why it wouldn't be enough, for example, to print out a copy of that email that got sent to the whole council and hand over a hard copy. That would only give you the publicly seen data. It wouldn't give you the metadata behind the record. Nor would it be sufficient if somebody said, I want the metadata for these requests, and they made that request correctly, to only give them Councilmember Robertson's version of the email and not Councilmember Stokes' version of the email. Now, there are some other exceptions to this, and they relate to the ability to technically comply. And I won't get too deep into the weeds on how those exceptions work. Suffice it to say that that's something that staff and IT will work on in terms of what form to produce records in. But what you need to remember is that there are reasons to retain records in their original electronic format. And metadata is one of those reasons. And so that's an important aspect of the retention program that the city operates. It's important to understand when you're creating unique records that might be subject to the Public Records Act. I mentioned staff. Generally, fortunately, staff coordinates and oversees PRA compliance. PRA requests to the city should be made to a public records officer or a particular identified point of contact, right? So if they're going to the PD, for example, they'll go to a different point of contact than if they're going to other city departments. That's how it should be done. And the city is set up to receive requests that way. But one other thing that you need to remember is if you get a request, it's still valid. So even if somebody says to you, I want records, they send you an email saying, I want records on this particular topic. They have not gone through the public records officer. They have not gone through the website or the way that the city has asked these requests to be submitted. Still, you've got a valid request. So what do? Forward that along to staff and they will take care of it and do it promptly, because there's a requirement that you make an initial response, the city make an initial response within 5 days. So if you get something that looks like a request for records, even if you're not sure, pass that along because folks will take care of it and you won't have to be responding in the first instance. And the last thing that I'll mention, and it's like the OPMA cases that Jessica was talking about, except much, much bigger numbers. And that is that you can get penalties under the Public Records Act, monetary penalties. They can be up to $100 a day. They used to be mandatory. Now the court can say, I'm not going to impose penalties, but in many cases they do. And they can even impose them on a per page basis. So if you had a request that encompassed 10 or 20,000 pages, you can imagine the exponential amounts of money that could be at stake in some of these cases. And there are. And attorney's fees also mandatory in that case. So like under the OPMA, if somebody spends 2 years litigating a public records case and the city loses, those fees are going to be significant in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I mentioned the Yusufian case here. That was a case that really launched a whole line of authority about how to calculate penalties and set up a whole bunch of criteria. And essentially, if you're acting in good faith, that's going to be a mitigating factor. It's going to reduce the number of penalties. It won't necessarily cure a violation. But what's also somewhat startling about the Yusufian case is that at the time this case came out, the total penalties awarded in that case, and that was an extreme example about records relating to the stadium referenda that were lost or destroyed, $371,000 in penalties were awarded in that case. At that time, that seemed like an enormous amount of money for a public records case. It's not anymore. We have had cases that have been into the millions, and I'm talking about fees and penalties combined. And you can see why when you're talking about cases, for example, that give the court discretion about how to calculate how many documents there are. And again, talking about how many electronic records and forms of electronic records we have. So I only mention this to emphasize the importance of making every good faith effort to comply, asking questions early and often if you're not sure how to comply, because that is the best way to avoid these types of cases. Almost always, if you're asking a question in advance, the situation can be addressed properly and avoid violations, certainly avoid large penalties or attorney's fees, and make sure that we're doing our part to meet our obligations to the public to produce records when they ask. And so that is the end of my presentation. I, like Jessica, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any comments or questions? I have one. The one thing that I have had to do because I can't get my printer, my work printer to print at my home is I have to forward a work email to my home printer, to my home email just to print it. And it's just really complicated. Is that something I need to work with IT to fix? Is that an issue, do you think?
Well, I don't think it's an issue. And obviously we've all been there. I've certainly been there the last year. What I would say about that is you are creating a unique public record when you forward that document to your personal email. So for example, the version that's on your city email and the version that's on your home email, those aren't the same record. Now, it may be a very boring record. It may be a record that has no retention value that could be deleted, but it's something worth checking into to make sure that if it needs to be retained, you're keeping it. And the other thing is that if there was a records request, if someone made a request and said, I want all communications to Mayor Robinson's home email account, and those were encompassed, you couldn't delete any of those emails while that request was pending. It would have to be filled. So those are the things you'd have to address, but it doesn't sound like there's an issue. It just sounds like you need to be cognizant of that. And, that's also a good reason to maybe see if there's a way to not have to do that going forward, because you are creating these records by doing it.
Okay. Councilmember Robertson.
Thanks, Matt and Jessica. So if you're doing that and you delete it as soon as you print it, I thought duplicate copies don't have retention value if it's just the same thing.
So I think that's probably correct in this case. And the way it's being described, if it's merely a transmittal or forwarding email, without knowing all the details about what's being forwarded, my guess is that would be a transitory record, and that it would not have any retention value, in which case you could delete it. Of course, the key would be, did you do it then? Because if the request came in and you had 10 of those emails that you hadn't deleted, then you'd have to hand those over. Even if they didn't have any retention value, you couldn't delete them at that point. But I think you're correct, Councilmember Robertson, that as a general matter, those types of forwarding emails, they don't have any substance to them. They probably are subject to being immediately deleted.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
All right, Mr. Miyake, what's up next?
So Mayor and council members, the next item on your agenda is an update on the city's finances. Tonight's update specifically will cover 3 topics. One is we would like to bring you up to speed how the general fund performed in 2020 as it relates to COVID, as well as what we are currently forecasting for 2021 as of the first quarter. Second, provide you a very high-level overview on the status of our general fund structural deficit given the latest financial update. And third, update the council on the American Rescue Plan American Rescue Plan Act recently passed by Congress, and ask for your direction to return on a consent calendar, future consent calendar, accepting the federal funding. After that, staff will return in the future with additional information on a gap analysis the community needs for your deliberation on how to allocate the city portion of the American Rescue Plan Act. Joining us this evening is Tony Call, Director, and Evan Phillips, Budget Manager with Finance and Asset Management Department. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, City Manager Miyake. Good evening, and Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council members. As always, it's a pleasure to be back with you this evening. Thank you for having us. Tonight with me, as City Manager Miyake just mentioned, I have 2 new faces for you. I have Evan Phillips and Will Wallow, both from the city's budget office. And as City Manager Miyake mentioned, we are seeking direction this evening. Next slide, please. Our agenda this evening is fairly straightforward. Evan Phillips will take a few minutes and go through our general fund 2020 performance. He will also touch on our 2021 first quarter performance, both of those things in light of how COVID has happened to us, how the economy shut down and then restarted. I will do a few short slides on the forecast update, and then I will turn it over to Will Wallow, who will take us through the American Rescue Plan Act, and then it will come back to me to finish up. So with that, Evan, I will turn it over to you for the general fund performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, Mayor Robinson, Deputy Mayor Neuenhuis, and council members. Overall, in 2020, the general fund performed better than expected, though the city did utilize $4.5 million in reserves to balance the year. As a reminder, the general fund supports most of the direct services to the community, including fire, police, parks and community services, community development, transportation, as well as most of the city's administrative functions, such as legal, city management, finance, customer service, HR, and others. The shutdown of the economy had a swift and substantial impact. Revenues ended the year $24 million, or 11% under budget. Primarily, this shortfall impacted our most economically sensitive revenues of sales and business and occupation taxes. Once the pandemic impacts were identified, the city took quick action, implementing 3 critical strategies to stabilize the general fund. The first of which was funding from the Federal CARES Act, which helped defray costs of staff time and purchases of PPE during the pandemic. Additionally, the Health Benefits Fund had excess reserves, and with the agreement of labor, the city was able to save the general fund $3.6 million. And finally, the largest impact was the underspending done by the city. In April, we implemented a 3% savings target, and by and large, departments exceeded that target. This was done by the institution of a hiring freeze, reduced discretionary expenditures for travel, training, and professional services, as well as savings associated with community centers and other city sites being shuttered during the pandemic. In total, these efforts garnered $11.5 million in savings, $5 million more than the target. Across all 3 of these mitigation strategies, the city reduced expenditures by $19 million in 2020 and limited pressure on the city's reserves. Before we move to talk about the budget performance for the first quarter of 2020, I will quickly provide an overview of the key areas that balance the budget. As you may recall, the adopted budget was solving for a $32 million shortfall over the biennium, and we had a 4-pronged path to balancing the budget. At the time, there was much uncertainty, therefore the adopted budget used one-time bridge structures where possible to buy time, including the phased opening of Fire Station 10 and doing a temporary 2-year transfer of sales tax from the CIP to the general fund. The adopted adjusted for modest increases in revenues, including a 1% property tax adjustment, which equated to $9 for a $1 million property, plus a few others. Additionally, the adopted budget invested in human services and equity programs. And to complete balancing the budget, half of the needed reductions were taken in cost containment reductions that limit surge capacity and discretionary expenditures, as well as reduce non-safety related maintenance, including reduced service levels for mowing, weeding, and watering. These changes maintain people-facing services, including public safety and human services, while showing our commitment to city staff. So with all of that background on the budget and how it was balanced, the good news is that we're looking to be close to budget for the first quarter of 2021. Revenues are performing slightly better than budget, though it's important to remember that even with these better numbers, the projected revenues are still below pre-pandemic forecasts. Now, the not so great news is that we have encountered some unforeseen expenditures due to the primarily to the winter storms that we had in February and January, and some one-time costs. The budget office staff will monitor expenditures throughout the year and will update council as the year develops. But the key takeaway is that this year is going to continue to require strong fiscal stewardship to navigate. Our latest forecast assumes that we will be spending down reserves by $3 million in 2021, which is less than the nearly $5 million that we had budgeted. It's possible the city will need to utilize more reserves if expenditures increase and/or our revenue figures don't come in as expected. So with that being said, let me hand it back to Tony to talk about how this current economic recovery compares to our most recent economic downturns.
Thanks, Evan. So before I kind of head into the forecast area and show you the traditional slide that I've shown you on the forecast, I want to take a minute and kind of do a relook at how we were doing from a recovery standpoint on the pandemic. So this slide uses sales tax as a proxy for the economy. It is our most highly volatile revenue stream. Therefore, it makes some sense that it would project the economy, and it does. You will notice that the .com and the Great Recession, both of those recessions had quite a long time till we got sales tax backs up to their pre-recessionary levels. You need to remember when those two events occurred, there were both structural issues within the economy. As you look at our pandemic recovery, you will see that we are coming back much quicker than those previous ones. And the real reason for that is there wasn't an economic structural issue within our economy that caused this recession. It was a public health shock, right? So In order for recovery to continue, and I know we've talked about this before, it takes our society to go back to those pre-pandemic behaviors and that pre-pandemic spending. Currently, we are forecasting recovery of sales tax back to 2022 at around the 2022 mark. And I think that's very similar to what you would see at some of our larger governments like the state of Washington and King County. Next slide, please. The challenges that gives is that even though we're seeing an economic boom coming back from that pandemic recovery, we are still forecasting the fact that our expenditure line, our expenditure growth will continue to outstrip our revenue growth. So let me take a minute and explain this chart. The top line, which is the blue line with the blue dots, that's our expenditure line. The green line with the green triangles is our revenue line. And you will notice as you look at year-end 2020, those are actual numbers, you'll see that expenditures exceeded revenues. And as Evan mentioned, we did use $4.5 million of reserves to balance 2020. As you look at 2021, you still see that inversion where expenditures are higher than revenues. And again, we budgeted almost $5 million to use in 2021. We're going to use a little less than that, at least at this point in the year. Our forecast 2022 shows that our budgeted numbers, we actually budgeted 22, that revenues and expenditures would be the same. And then as we head forward into the out years, you will see once again that our expenditures will exceed our revenue growth. The 2023 mark, the reason you kind of see a gap there, that maybe get a little bit larger, is that is the year in which we bring on the new facility of Fire Station 10. And so that will cause some increased costs to the city that are included in this forecast. So with that, there's one thing that's not in this forecast before I move on. There's one thing that's not in this forecast that I think is important, and that is the American Rescue Plan Act funding. The city will receive $20 million if you authorize us to accept that funding. 10 million this year, 10 million the next year. That funding is not included in this forecast until we have a better idea of how that funding will be allocated. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Will to take us through the American Rescue Act plan.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and Council members. I will be providing a high-level overview of the American Rescue Plan Act, along with some additional information about other legislation that could serve as potential sources of funding for the city. The American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which I'll refer to hereafter as ARPA, was signed into law on March 11th, 2021, and allocated $1.9 trillion across a variety of programs intended to address the economic, social, and public health impacts of COVID-19. The majority of the funding in ARPA went towards the following programs: $1,400 checks for individuals making under $75,000 a year, providing enhanced unemployment insurance, expanding tax credit programs, and providing direct funding for education and pension systems. The remainder of the bill provided funding for a wide range of programs, with the largest program being the state and local government fiscal aid program known as the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. I will be going into more detail regarding that funding shortly. Next slide, please. Before diving into the state and local fiscal recovery funds, I want to highlight that ARPA is not the only significant piece of legislation enacted in the past several months, with funding available for human services programs, economic recovery, small business support, and public health needs. As you can see, there's a substantial amount of funding available through multiple federal, state, and local pieces of legislation. The amounts listed here on this slide refer to the amounts that city staff have determined that the city of Bellevue, residents, small businesses, nonprofits, or community organizations can potentially access for relief funding. The programs we have identified in these bills are grant-based and provide funding that is restricted for specific purposes. The city is taking deliberate action to connect businesses, community organizations, and residents to these resources through existing networks and outreach. Some specific examples include connecting local businesses to the Working Washington grant program provided by the Department of Commerce, as well as connecting tenants and landlords to funding made available through King County's Eviction Prevention and Rental Assistance Program, as well as the United Way of King County Rental Assistance Program. City staff are also continuing to evaluate where gaps in the provision of resources continue to exist. Next slide, please. So getting back to the state and local fiscal recovery funds, ARPA established the funds to deliver $350 billion to eligible states, metropolitan cities, counties, tribal governments, and non-entitled units of local government to respond to the impacts of COVID-19. As a metropolitan city, Bellevue is allocated $20.1 million in funding to be distributed directly from the U.S. Treasury Department. This funding will come in two tranches, $10 million when the agreement is signed, and the second tranche roughly 12 months later. This funding has a very broad range of eligible uses. Per the Treasury Department's interim final rule, the following broad categories are considered eligible uses. First, responding to the public health emergency or its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. Second, providing premium pay to eligible essential workers employed by local governments, or by providing grants to eligible employers that have eligible workers who perform essential work. Third, for the provision of government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue relative to revenues collected in the most recent full fiscal year prior to the emergency. And lastly, to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. The Treasury Department has interpreted the legislative requirement that eligible costs must be incurred by December 31st, 2024, to mean that recipients have to have obligated or contracted the funds for use by December 31st, 2024. However, the funds may subsequently be spent to cover those obligations by December 31st, 2026. Bellevue will be required to provide quarterly monitoring reports through the end of 2026 to the Treasury Department regarding how we use these funds. Unlike some of the funding that we see available in other pieces of legislation, the money provided for in ARPA is highly fungible and can be used to fill gaps not addressed by funding through other sources. Now I'll turn it back to Tony to discuss next steps.
Thanks, Will. So before you this evening, we'll be asking for direction to return on a consent calendar to accept the $20.1 million in ARPA funding. We will continue to diligently work with our business communities and our community organizations and our nonprofits to connect them up to those more restricted grant-funded options. There's quite a bit of money to the tune of billions of dollars, and we want to make sure we use those funds first and foremost because they are restricted funding. And then we're currently working on a list of gaps between the things that are restricted and the current needs in our community, and staff will return to you with that recommendation for discussion and direction. Next slide, please. I believe timeline. So lastly, when thinking about those series of next steps, we sort of see the timeline looking like this. We will continue to connect those community members up. If you direct us this evening, we will bring back to you next week on a consent calendar a resolution authorizing the acceptance of ARPA. Once that is done, there's administrative work that has to occur. We assume we will see the cash for that first $10 million come into the city's coffers sometime in June or July. Not sure on the exact date. We're working on that staff analysis, and we plan to come back to you in July for discussion and direction on that $20 million. With that, I believe the last slide, we'll ask for your direction and turn it back to the mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. Great presentation. Are there any comments or questions on this? I see Deputy Mayor, I see Councilmember Barksdale, I see Zahn, just a second. And I see Stokes. Okay, let's see. Go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. First, great presentation, Tony, Evan, Will. We're so blessed as a city to have such a crack budget and finance team. So even if all the news is not great here, but a couple of quick questions for you. I'll do it in rapid fire session here. So on slide number 6, the overage, what was it? I think it was slide 6 of about $1 million. And I think Evan, you had mentioned that was that mainly due to the winter storms, or were there other reasons for the $1 million, or was it primarily due to that? I might not remember very well, but I didn't think it was that bad of a winter storm this past year. But I'm just curious if there was other reasons for that $1 million.
Sure, I can step in there, Deputy Mayor. Yes, we did have a winter storm this past year. We also had several other settlements that occurred in the city and some additional one-time costs. So it was kind of a collection of things that has brought that overage to bear. We do anticipate, as we monitor through the course of this year, because remember, that's just the first quarter, we do anticipate monitoring over the course of the year, and we'll bring back to you further updates if we see challenges in a different direction.
Terrific, thank you. And now on to the next question about reserves. So we used about, 4.5, maybe use another 3. Where are reserves then currently at once if we do use up to the, what, $7 million?
So at the end of 2020, Deputy Mayor, at the end of 2020, I think we were right close to 18.5% left of our reserves. We had council policy down to 15%. I'm not sure what the number would be after 2021, but I suspect it wouldn't be much less than that 18.5% number.
Thank you. Okay.
I think it'd be somewhere around 18% as a gut, but we can find that out exactly for you.
Okay, thank you. And then on the American Rescue Plan Act, so it sounds to me, since, I mean, I think we can make a legitimate argument that COVID has impacted every aspect of the city and our services, et cetera. Are there any restrictions that we need to be aware of in terms of where and how we can use that money? It sounds like it's quite wide open in terms of filling in any gaps that we perceive are most crucial, or we feel that's what money needs to go towards. Again, be it anything from human services needs to any other needs that may have fallen behind, or we need to shore up due to COVID. Can you speak to that a little bit, Tony?
I'll give it a start and then I'll turn it over to Will to finish it up.
Okay.
There's some things that we can't spend the money on. We can't spend it on pension funding. It's very clearly laid out there. We also cannot spend it on revenue loss that was not associated with the pandemic. And I believe the third thing we cannot spend it on, Will, and do you happen to know what that is off the top of your head?
There are actually two other things we can't spend it on. We cannot spend it on the payment of principal or interest on outstanding debt. And we cannot use it for deposits into rainy day funds, financial reserves, or similar funds.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, terrific. And again, great presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Councilmember Barksdale.
Great, thank you, Mayor. And thanks, Tony, Evan, and Will, for the presentation. One quick question. I know we have our mid-buy coming up, and I know you're going to bring back the gap analysis in June. Can you talk a little bit about how those two sync up? Just trying to get a sense of when we might be able to engage around where we might want to have proposals for allocating funding.
Sure, I can speak a little bit to that. So as we head into the mid-buy, our focus on the mid-buy will be looking at that long-range impact and the deficits that we'll be approaching. So we'll be spending some time on that. We'll also be ensuring that we, as we do with every mid-biennium, is shore up our technical adjustments that need to occur. That compared to the ARPA money, I think are slightly two different things, even though there is probably a space where they overlap. The ARPA money really is about how we would respond to the COVID. It is one-time money and should be spent on one-time things. We anticipate probably coming back to you during the month of July to talk further on that. So that's when we anticipate coming back. So I think it will come ahead of the mid-biennium at this point. We might though find still there's some overlap that we want to hold on to. So I think that there's plenty of space. Again, we don't have to spend that money, but we have to encumber it by 2024. We don't have to spend it till 2026. So we've got some time on the ARPA money.
Okay, thank you.
Question?
It does, thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Zahn.
Yeah, well, I echo my colleagues to thank you, Tony, Evan, and Will, on this amazing work that you do. You always help us understand financially where we're at, to understand where the gaps are between revenue and expense, and really appreciate it because I think it matters. What I wanted to make sure I understood is, it looks like in the graph, we're saying that our revenues are going to be back to pre-pandemic levels by 2022. And that if I look at the gap analysis between revenue and expense, it looks like once Fire Station 10 goes into effect, we're in that $8 to $10 million gap between revenue and expense, and that looks pretty stable. So are you expecting that graph to look that way? So if we can find a way to really look at that gap and closing that shortfall, then the two lines are going to stay pretty aligned. So that was one of the things I wasn't sure about.
Mm-hmm. Councilmember Zahn, so I think that in looking at pictures, sometimes they can be a bit deceiving. The actual delta actually grows a little bit in each year. So our revenue growth grows somewhere about 0.5% to 0.75% less than our expenditure growth. So it does tend to widen, but we're talking widening by $500,000 to $1 million in each year. And I think looking at that graph, it probably doesn't give enough. There's not enough delta,
not enough gradation to see that.
Okay, to see that piece. So it does increase over years, but I do agree with you that there is a piece in 2023 that would help us get over to another jump. I do agree with that.
Okay, and then as we look at the $20.1 million, you'll be coming back with a recommendation on how much of that money we might need internally for municipal government gap related to COVID expense, as well as how much we would recommend making available to serve the community. Because certainly I'm concerned about the eviction moratorium lifting and just the volume of people in our community. I was hearing that potentially 8% of people in our state's is going to have troubles paying their rent when the moratorium lifts. So I wanted to understand what's actually going to come back in July.
Well, what will come back in July, it's still being formulated, but we will bring back the next steps on the ARPA funding. I think because we've got time to spend it, we have to think about what's the right amount to spend early versus later. And I'm not sure I have an answer for you this evening, but I do think it has to fit within those 4 categories. And we'll bring back a recommendation for discussion direction as we get into that, and as we get into July.
And we would want to, since you said, right, look at the non-ARPA funds so that as much as possible, those restricted funds at the state and federal level and the county as well, leveraging those funds as much as possible so that then our money can be used, as you said, the most fungible to serve those needs that these other funding buckets doesn't cover?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Councilmember Stokes. Excuse me, I don't think you're unmuted yet.
You don't think so?
There you are.
Anyhow, really staff really appreciate the presentation, of course, and they're just really superb. I just want to make clear, I mean, this is, I was just thinking about this, if someone's watching this, we understand a lot of what you're talking about. You're kind of putting 2 different reports together in one that integrate, but the thing we need to focus on tonight is accepting the 20.1 million. The other is just to give us a heads up on where we're going on these other pieces. And it seems that, and I think you set it up very well to continue to have that. I'm looking forward to that as we go along on that. And obviously, as Councilmember Zahn said, we'll have to look at how does some of this 20.1 million help us in these other areas. So we're at a stage where it's all a little bit fluid and complicated right now, but you're keeping on top of that. And I think what you're saying is somewhere down the line, obviously at the mid-buy and further, there are some serious financial discussions we're going to have and look at things. And you're giving us a preview and understanding that rather than coming back in 2023 and say, guess what, guys, we got a big gap. We know this. And so but you're setting it up in a way that I really appreciate so that we will know where we're going and be able to track that as we talk about the 20.1 million and these things happening in the pandemic, and obviously coming in with all the other things we have going. So I think really having the overall look and a kind of a forecast of where it's going to go if we just go along as we're doing now really will help us. And I appreciate that. I think that's very important to have this all the time, knowing where we're going rather than come along at budget year and say, oh, by the way, So again, the goal tonight is to get the 20.1 passed, but the other is to, as a starter and continuing a conversation. And I really appreciate the way you set it up. And not that I would expect anything different, except you always keep exceeding yourself and your staff. Keep doing that. So that's good. Thank you.
Councilmember Robertson, did you have your hand up?
I did. Thank you. Is it my turn? So, no, I am in favor of moving this ahead and accepting it. I personally, in my day job, been doing a lot of work to advise my clients on ARPA funding. So I just wanted to share a little bit more information and then share with so staff knows my perspective on this. In addition to the items that staff listed that we can't spend the money on, we also can't spend it on settlements of litigation or judgments, costs incurred prior to March 3rd, 2021, and as matching fund for federal matches. The lost revenue is interesting because the amount of the ARPA funds is 21 million. And according to the presentation tonight, we lost 24 million. The way that the federal government is doing it is you are looking at your last full year of revenue. You can go back a few years to see the trend line, and any reduction in revenue for year 2020 to 2021 is presumed to be a COVID caused loss. And you take the 2019 and you can either add the trend line percentage increase or 4.1% increase, whichever's higher. So for me, it's like when you're on an airplane and they say, put your oxygen mask on first before you help other people. This is kind of like an oxygen mask for government. And to the extent that we have lost revenue, I think that that's a really appropriate way to deal with it. There's a lot of cuts we had to make in order to try to keep us on the side of, in the black, which we have to do. And so I would highly be interested in using it for that purposes. And if not for that purposes, then for some of the infrastructure purposes of the water system, broadband, et cetera, or sewer, because we never have enough money to do all of those things. So that's just my perspective on it. But just wanted to weigh in and thank staff for the great presentation, and looking forward to deciding how we're going to best use this money as a group.
Thank you. Councilor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Hi, Tony, and your staff, Ivan and Will. Always great and concise presentation, very clear. I got a couple of questions. Before I ask you, I kind of agree with Councilmember Robertson. One, I think it's obvious that I definitely think we would definitely we're willing to receive the money. And two is, we need to look into a little bit more how we can be able to help some other sources that we really can consider. Specifically, I have a couple of questions. One is the necessary investment under your $28.1 million that we receive. The guidance that we can actually make necessary investment in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructures. My question is, what other infrastructure we might be able to, to use for? Just something to consider and think about. Broadband is included, but maybe there's some technology infrastructure that could be included. And I don't know why it's specifically to broadband. So just a question. And we will do obviously, Councilmember Robertson mentioned, water and others perhaps, but I just want to maybe have some, possibilities elsewhere. The second one is we can respond to the negative economic impacts. And I think that's where we should be also looking at, economic development projects, well, you mentioned tourism and others. So maybe there's a broader scope where we actually, definitely are impacted and definitely can help. And specific to that is broad, obviously. Small businesses, they are affected, they're out of business, they're really struggling. So a number of things perhaps that can help us. So again, just opening up, leaving the door more open. And so that's it. Thank you. Yeah, you can talk about it a little bit, or you can just take that into consideration. Thanks.
Councilman, I can respond a little bit, and then as we come back to council in July, we can talk more about it. I am not aware of other necessary investments outside of broadband, water, sewer that are listed in the bill, but we'll certainly do a deep dive and look into that for you. I'm not aware of one, but I promise to look. So there's that one. And yes, the economic development projects and the small businesses, they were impacted by COVID, and they certainly do fit within the guidance. And we certainly can talk about that in the future as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, thank you for the presentation. I just have a few comments here. I agree a lot with what Councilmember Lee just said. He and I both work with the Greater Seattle Partners in creating that economic recovery guidelines that just came out last week. And it was really interesting how they narrowed it down to two key things. One was investing in childcare, and the other is investing in women of color, and how the lack of investment in those two areas is how much that has cost our economy. So when we're looking at this rescue money, it seems like instead of just creating subsidies to bridge people, we should really be looking at how we get people solidly on their feet. And to me, that includes job training, small business assistance, and access to high-speed internet. So I hope that, we can take this money and we can do an analysis of some of the things that are going on in Bellevue with the community, and maybe find things that weren't even called out in that Greater Seattle Partners work there. But I'd really like to dig kind of deep and take this opportunity to right some wrongs that maybe we have going on in our city, to give people a fair opportunity to succeed.
We can bring it all back. We commit to doing that.
Great. Okay, any more questions or comments? Okay, we have one more. Mr. Miyake.
Mayor, I think we need a motion
sorry.
before we're able to move on.
You are right about that. Is there a motion to direct staff to return with this?
I move to direct staff to return with the resolution authorizing acceptance of the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds authorized by the American Rescue Plan Act.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And that passes. Thank you very much. Okay, now Mr. Miyake. Could you
Okay.
introduce our last one?
Yeah, the last item on your agenda this evening is an update on the Downtown Park Northeast Gateway project. And just by way of background, this project has been contemplated since the 1980s, and completing this project became a council priority back in 2018. Construction is substantially complete and was open to the public last Friday. Joining this evening for more detail and about this particular project is Michael Shiosaki, Director of our Parks and Community Service Department, as well as joining him is Pam Furman, the Planning and Development Manager. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you very much. And I will ask Pam to get the PowerPoint up and running. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, City Council members, and City Manager Miyake. I'm Michael Shiosaki, and tonight, I'll say that again, Pam Fairman and I will provide an update on the Downtown Park Northeast Corner Gateway project. I know that some of you had the opportunity to check out the project in person last Friday, as the construction fencing was just coming down. Next slide, please. This evening's presentation is for your information only. And next slide, please. So here's an outline of the presentation for this evening. First, some history and background on the planning and design of the downtown park. Then the project goals and objectives for the Northeast Corner project, followed by project funding and the overall schedule. And then construction progress through several construction process through the construction process photos. So, and then followed by next steps. Next slide, please. And again. So first, a little background on the downtown park. In 1984, an international competition for the design of the park resulted in the selection of a design submitted by Beckley Myers Architects. Council adopted the master plan for the Bellevue downtown park that included the distinctive circular promenade, water features, and large flexible multi-use central open space. Then in 1997, with the help of a citizens advisory committee appointed by the council and a team of consultants led by McLeod Record Landscape Architects and the architect, Robert Beckley, who was the original designer of the park, the master plan was updated. The updated plan reflected land acquisitions and plan refinements that included the noteworthy entry connection at the northeast corner of the park at Bellevue Way and Northeast 4th Street. Major construction phases were completed in 1986, 1990, and most recently in 2017. The 2017 project completed the circle and many of the features contemplated in the original master plan. The northeast corner of the downtown park and the major connection to Bellevue Way, however, remained unfinished. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a closer look at the 1997 master plan, showing what was originally envisioned for the northeast corner. And next slide. In July of 2017, the City Council approved a contract with McLeod Record to refine the park's master plan vision by furthering the design and completing permitting and design work to construct the northeast corner project. The goals of the master plan for this new corner entry were to open up the park with a welcoming entrance connecting the park to Bellevue Way, eliminating the alley. Also wanted to make sure the plaza would feel like a park and not a commercial plaza. Greenery should soften and not hide the park. And the use of water and art to draw visitors in, but not overwhelm or overpower the entry. Next slide, please. So in addition to being one of the final phases of implementing the downtown park's master plan, it is the beginning of implementing the vision of the Grand Connection. The framework plan for the Grand Connection identifies the northeast corner of the downtown park as a key gateway for Bellevue and the Grand Connection route as an important transition from downtown Bellevue into a more intimate environment of the park and ultimately Old Bellevue. The report identifies this space as an opportunity to create a gateway between the bustling intersection and the natural green elements of the park, suggesting a small corner plaza with a modest water feature to help activate the space. The report additionally identifies the northeast corner of the downtown park as a significant public art opportunity, and the City Council identified completion of the downtown park northeast corner project in the 2018-2020 City Council vision priorities. Next slide, please. The city's Community Development Department has been working with parks to coordinate and integrate the Grand Connection framework throughout downtown and downtown park, including the positioning of a significant piece of art to be placed in the Northeast Gateway Plaza. In December of 2017, Mark Fornas of the Very Many Studio was selected from a pool of 98 applicants by a panel of community members, professional artists, and a member of the Bellevue Arts Commission. Based on the collaborative work with the park's design team, the artists presented concepts for discussion to a joint meeting of the Parks and Community Services Board and the Arts Commission. The Arts Commission voted to approve the final artwork design in 2019. And just last September, the City Council approved the fabrication and design of the artwork, and that artwork is scheduled for installation later this summer. Next slide, please. The artist concept for this piece involves an integrated structure with a pierced canopy of organic forms of different sizes and shapes that evoke a forest canopy and the dappled sunlight of the forest floor. Next slide, please. So going back a bit, in 1983, when the city purchased the majority of land for downtown park, the Union High School building was there, but it was already closed and it remained on the property. When the buildings were demolished to construct downtown park, the city preserved the arch facade of the Union High entry. So a touchstone or a remembrance of the past, the Union High Arch artifacts have been reintroduced into the downtown park in an archway entrance into the formal garden. And you'll see an image of that new arch in just a minute. So next up, project funding. So $9.25 million in the CIP, and that includes funding $5.4 million of 2008 Parks Levy funding, in addition to a $1 million grant from the Washington State Department of Commerce, and the remainder of that CIP money is from real estate excise tax. In addition, $70,000 of neighborhood enhancement program funding was added for the southeast corner stairway on Northeast 2nd Street. So last but not least is the construction schedule. Open bids in February of 2020. On April 20th, the council awarded that contract, and work began just about a year ago on the project and was, as the city manager talked about, was substantially complete just last Friday. So with that, I will now hand off to Pam Fairman for the remainder of the presentation. Thank you. I think you're muted, Pam.
Sorry
there you
about
go.
that. Good evening, Council. We'd like to share a few construction highlights with you that help illustrate the great work accomplished by city staff, Ken Krager, our park project manager, team architecture and engineering led by McLeod Record and Ono Construction, and just so many others. On the slide, you'll see two aerial photographs, 2020 before construction and a fall 2021 during construction. I'll say of note, the elimination of the back alley from Northeast 4th Street that has allowed a much stronger and safe pedestrian connection from the downtown commercial area into the downtown park. In the fall 2020 aerial, you can see the circular plaza taking shape that will eventually hold new artwork. The larger photograph shows the new plaza entrance and strong connection created from downtown into downtown park and to Main Street and the waterfront, the grand connection. Other photos show the coordinated foundation work to support the future art installation, a new entry into the formal garden, a stairway, and a new route into that garden that was often really hidden and was not really very well known as part of the park. A few more photographs showing construction underway. The Union High Arch has been reintroduced after 38 years in storage. The arch emphasizes an entrance into the formal garden, not an exact replica of the original high school entrance. However, some original materials were preserved and reused. The plaza water feature was designed to draw visitors in and provide the pleasant sound of falling water. A portion of the construction work, not located in the northeast corner of the park, included a community-suggested neighborhood enhancement program project to improve access into the park by adding a new stairway in the southeast corner, allowing better access. Beyond an attractive feature and noise softening effect, the plaza water feature offers opportunities for changing colors to coordinate with seasons and city events. And a spectacular photograph showing the night lighting welcome offered to downtown park and Northeast Gateway Plaza. Our final photograph was taken just last Friday, June 4th, when the plaza opened for use. The photograph was taken standing at the downtown park circular promenade, looking toward the Northeast Gateway Plaza to downtown Bellevue. The plaza is substantially complete and open for public use. Staff will continue working to complete minor construction punch list items. And we're looking forward to seeing the Grand Connection public art installed and anticipating that to occur the end of summer. And then this fall, celebrating the grand opening with you. And this concludes the presentation this evening, and I want to thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. Can you raise your hand if you have a comment or question on this? I see Councilmember Barksdale and Deputy Mayor. Go ahead, Councilmember Barksdale.
All right, thank you, Mayor, and thanks, Michael. And I see your last name, Furman, Mrs. Furman.
Pam.
Pam. Just a couple questions. So one, really cool to see the gateway completed. I drove by it or rode by it over the weekend and really enjoyed it. One category of questions, if you will, in terms of programming, what sort of programming do we have planned, and is it possible for people to rent the space for special events? I mean, as a gateway, I could see it really being utilized for, like, say, cultural events that really draw people into the downtown park. And then the second question, for like the garden area and so forth, do we have any partnerships that we are leveraging, whether it's internal or external to the city, like the Bellevue Urban Garden or the staff that helps to manage the arboretum, the botanical garden?
You know, I think in terms of scheduling the plaza, I think we'll have to wait for the art to show up and see how it all kind of functions. But I think it could be a space that that could serve small events. So we will definitely take a look at that. In terms of volunteers in the formal garden, Pam, are you aware of any formal partnerships we have there?
We do not have formal partnerships in the garden right now. Certainly the Bellevue Botanical Garden has celebrated the formal garden, and lights have appeared in downtown. The holiday lights have appeared in downtown park, but we do not have a formal partnership right now.
Okay, thanks. I think it would be really cool to maybe have some partners there, maybe for educational purposes or what have you. So, thank you.
Okay, Deputy Mayor.
Well, thank you so much, Michael and Pam, for the great presentation. And yeah, we had the pleasure of, I think, Councilmember Zahn and Councilmember Stokes, Councilmember Lee, and the mayor and myself were able there to get a little bit of a sneak peek there as the gates were taken down. It's just stunning. It is just such a wonderful addition. That gateway is just going to be so enjoyed by so many residents in the city, and even more so when the art installation is complete at the end of the summer. So it'll just be fantastic. So just kudos all around, and really kudos to the council many years before any of us were on this Bellevue City Council that had the vision for this. It's just amazing to see this come to fruition. Couple of quick questions for you on the presentation. So on slide number 9, it just dawned on me that I saw some tables and chairs there. Is that still part of the plan to have some seating areas for people to enjoy coffee or lunch if they want to do from the nearby, businesses or retail, et cetera? Is that still part of the plan, or is that no longer part of it?
I'll look to you on that one, Pam. I'm not sure if there's furniture in there or not right now.
We have our typical downtown park benches, and we have some larger seating benches in the plaza. Certainly, we are looking for ways to activate that plaza and partnering with the Bellevue Downtown Association to bring life to that, to help bring life to that plaza. Currently, there are no tables and chairs, we'll say movable type, in the park.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't mean to put you on a spot because I saw that rendering there, and I was like, hey, those weren't there. I wonder if we're going to add those. Second question is on the gateway. Looks just so amazing at night with all the lights. So 2 questions there. Actually, just one on that art installation. Is that going to be lit up as well? I don't think it is, but will that have any kind of light component to it during the evening?
You might have noticed that when you saw that night photo, that there were lights in the ground. So yes, it's up lighting for that.
Oh, terrific. Art. Okay. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. And again, great presentation. Thank you.
Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, this is really exciting to see the progression in this. And you know, what is it, 2017 when we finished the other part of the children's fact and redid that whole section, and then it's been redone since then. And this is kind of the putting the real icing on the cake in a sense of that. And it's been really exciting, and I had the privilege of being you know, working with the Arts Commission on this, and that was a very, very interesting process going through to come up with this. And I think everybody was very excited about it. And it's just going to be, again, it's one of these things when you do the planning and you have everything, and when it actually happens, it's so much fun to be there and say, wow, you know, this is real now. And it's all fitting together and just amazing. And I think what's going to be really exciting about this is this will be a key thing that kind of says to the community, we're back. We get this pandemic. Hopefully we're going to a good space on that, and having this type of facility ready, and the fact that we continue to work through this. It would have been kind of easy to say, well, that's something we don't have to do right now, but you know, kudos to the staff and to the city manager's office and to the council for saying, let's keep on this. And I think that's been very important. And I've had some people make that comment about, wow, you're still doing things like art and fixing the park up. And I think that's very, very important thing we've done. So I'm really excited about seeing it and going out there. And I hope we can have a lot of different ways to utilize that space, you know, in the future. And it's just going to continue to be a great, you know, attraction for the city and that downtown park. And given that this is also located in our largest neighborhood, it really enhances the whole downtown area, and connecting with the you know, the trail and the Grand Connection, all that. It's just one other kind of jewel in the crown. So great work and great presentation. Really looking forward to enjoying it. So thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, I echo my colleagues. It's an amazing park. And I have to say, I haven't been there at night yet. So I feel like although I was there last Friday, the special lighting and features just looks phenomenal. And so I look forward to that. What it made me think about, especially for activating the space, is do we have built-in electrical infrastructure? So if we wanted to have musicians play there, there's a way to get everything plugged in without a bunch of, you know, cords for tripping. And then the other one was, I was also thinking with all the features that we have there now, where you were talking about, right, the arch from the old school, and, you know, in downtown park, we also have the World War I monument there. Do we have any beacons or those things where when people are walking around their phone, if they were interested in learning about what the art or different features are, they can be engaged in that space? So those were some things I was just wondering about.
So in terms of the beacons, are you talking about QR codes, or are you talking about something?
Yeah, they're a little bit like that, so that folks can be walking around, and if they're walking near a feature, it pops up with information on their phone. And so I know it's things that we've talked about in other places that I've been connected with, where more and more of these interactive type of ways to engage with the community when they are in our parks or facilities.
I don't believe we have those in the downtown park right now. I mean, it's definitely something we should look at, so it helps interpret the history of what's there. And you're right, there's monuments, and maybe it's not as well explained as it could be. And then your other question was about outlets for events and plugins. I believe that's a part of the plaza, isn't it, Pam?
Yes, it is.
And planning for activation, right. Definitely.
And maybe that's that first one with the beacons could be a partnership with BDA about ideas of, as they're helping activate the space. Maybe that would be kind of a fun way to engage with the community that are visiting. Thanks.
Any more comments or questions? I think I see Councilmember Lee.
Thank you. I just want to relate that I had the opportunity the last week to spend a couple, 3 evenings at Downtown Park. And I know the mayor lives right close to Downtown Park. So I don't want her to have all the fun. It was an enjoyment. And, after I was there doing the photo op, and, previously the Monday we had this downtown rally, I spent a little time, just be there walking around, and I sat on the bench, and it's just amazing. People walk by, and I started having conversation, and some friend I haven't seen for a while, and say, hey, just stop by and chat it. And we were just very fortunate. The weather was just perfect. So, I hear that all the great stuff we want to add, but just on the level, this is just a wonderful asset right in the middle of downtown. Now connecting to Maidenbauer Park all the way going through Downtown Park. This vision is being realized when we put in the pedestrian corridor, 30 years ago, and it's now really becoming reality. And so when we look at it, when the development has happened, just a block north of it, and then south of it, we're able to maintain the viable Main Street or the restaurant eating places. And, I was able to sit there and be both chatting with people, saying hello to people I haven't seen for a while. And same time, I was able to actually do business on my cell phone for half an hour. So it's just a wonderful place, gathering place. That's really the key. Then, of course, further south, this is the imagination playground, right? I mean, just amazing. And the families, everybody's out there. And it's just ultimately, what I said, it's a gathering place. Thank you for doing all this, completing it. And as I always said before, Bellevue always does things better than expected. The result is always amazing. Well done. Good job. Thanks.
Well, Pamela and Michael, congratulations and thank you. Really fantastic. And I can't wait for the artwork to come in. Any more comments or questions? If not, I believe we are done. So we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next week. Oh, that's a wave. Okay, good. Good night.